So it is starting. It should start in. Yes, now it is live. Awesome. So, hello everyone. So today we are in the company of one of the most important thinkers right now from Israel, Ilan Pappé. And I want to actually begin this interview, this conversation, I should say. It's not an interview, but a conversation with highlighting one fact, which is the shadow banning that's happening in digital media right now, and which was the primary motive of my invitation to Ilan Pape. And just to give a context of how it happened, why I figured it out myself is that. So I'll give you a basic scenario so that everybody understands. On Ilan, you also understand. Like this is what is happening,
Mhm.
and this is how digital media is actually terrorizing, I don't know, or targeting posts like this, and which is that even if I post randomly on Facebook on my page, just a white photo without any post whatsoever, within a week I will get the stats that it has reached around 1,000 people. I mean, even if it is of no consequence whatsoever. But as soon as I posted your video on YouTube and then shared it on the on Facebook page. It has been now almost 2 weeks, and it shows me it has reached hardly 137 people. So you see the point I'm trying to make. So normally my posts go up to 20,000 people, 25,000, even more than 100,000 for the philosophy room. But as soon as there is something regarding Palestine, especially criticism of Palestine, the algorithm functions as such that it automatically stops the spreading of the information. Now, which is quite amazing. I mean, in the sense that I don't know, how do you see it? I mean, do you call it cyber terrorism? Now we call it digital terrorism. I don't know. So I want to begin first of all with this, and then obviously then the introduction will follow and everything.
Yeah, yeah. So great to be in this room, the philosophy room, with all of you. Yes, I encountered this policy by Meta, at least by Meta, which is the main organization that runs Facebook, Instagram, and so on. And I think that, in fact, there are now legal outfits, at least in Britain and the United States, that are trying to work against it. So this is an established fact that there is a censorship on Palestine through the algorithm, and it's part of the wider attempt to silence any support for Palestine through means of intimidation and censorship. Um, I'm not surprised by it. I've watched the lobbying for Israel and its effective work for years, and they adapt themselves to the means of communication. So before internet, they would have done it to major television station, broadsheet newspapers, or mainstream media in general. And now they are just doing it in the cyberspace. Um, I think some of us, and I know more about the younger generation of activists, are very inventive and find ways of circumventing this, because after all, it's an algorithm, and find alternative media for do this. I think it's part of the struggle. I mean, the struggle on the ground is far more violent, far more existential, far more terrible. But the struggle outside for people's cognition, people's support, people's information is also a very important struggle. And anybody who thought that this would go unchallenged uh, is mistaken. I mean, the same power that uses force on the ground is using force in the media. I do remember how one of the greatest anti-Zionist Israeli activists who passed away told me once that that when I was more or less censored in my own university in Haifa and eventually forced to leave, Tanya Reinhardt was her name, the late Tanya Reinhardt. And I said to her, I'm so surprised by the violence that the university directs against one historian. And she said to me, why are you surprised? I mean, this is the same power that uses all its force to demolish houses, to expel people, to occupy. Why do you think that they would be less violent in treating dissidents from within, dissidents from without, or anyone else that they think is not towing the line? So, yeah, we used to call it in the old days epistemic violence, which is not as brutal as real violence, but as important.
Thank you so much, Ilan. Yes, that so you actually gave me the chance to discuss a question which I've actually put for the later time, but this will also give me the chance to actually dive into the book, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and which is about reading history, as you said right now, and the academic behavior when discussing this issue. Because generally speaking, I don't know, you might correct me because you know much more than I do. Like whenever we encounter a general history book which discusses the history of, let's say, the 20th century, we start reading it, we come to the 1940s, we go to the World War II and the Holocaust, obviously, and then we go to the struggle between the US and the Soviet Union. I mean, generally speaking, I mean that's the image at least I've got whenever I picked up anything. And if you want to know anything about the Middle East, then you have to pick up a book which is specially dedicated to that region. For example, your book on Palestine. So there seems to, and this is what we saw in the U.S. universities as well, that there is this deliberate academic silence on this issue. But what about, as you said, this epistemic shadow banning or whatever, or terrorism, as whatever you want to put it that way, is like there is this deliberate academic silence on the issue of the origins of Israel and Palestine issue.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about this academic silence on this issue?
First of all, it's important to say that things do change with time. So I would say that until the late 1980s, more or less the mid 1990s, in the mainstream academia in the West or in the global North, call it what you want, the only version of events about Palestine, if Palestine was at all discussed, was the Israeli one. And it was a very clear narrative by which the return of the Jews to Palestine was celebrated as both a miracle and a historical act of justice. And any resistance to that project was framed as terrorism and unjustified acts of violence. And this was the dominant version until the mid 1990s. But things have changed, at least in some centers of academic centers around the world, uh, partly because Israeli historians like myself, and I was not the only one, in the early 1990s began to publish books based on Israeli documentation that corroborated quite a few of the main claims made by the Palestinians over the years and challenged the basic Israeli narrative of what happened in Palestine since the arrival of Zionism in the 19th century. Secondly, a new generation of Palestinian scholars that were not there before, in a way, or were not heard, actually, they were there before, but they were not heard, began to be heard. And people like Edward Said, who published a very important book, The Question of Palestine, helped to change the attitude, at least in some academic centers, to the history of Palestine in general and that of 1948 in particular. So I think today, looking back, you can say that in 2024, there is a change in the way Palestine is being taught, researched, engaged with, but not everywhere. I think there's a huge difference, for instance, between countries such as France, Germany, and Italy, to give you three major countries, where it's still very difficult to find teachings and courses that provide also the Palestinian perspective. But if you go to Britain, the United States, to Scandinavia, definitely to countries in the global south, you can see that something has shifted in the way we talk about it. So the silence in the academia, I think, has been successfully challenged. It is the silence in the mainstream media that is very difficult to break. And because of that, I think it's also very difficult to challenge the narrative which politicians, especially in the West, believe in, or even if they don't believe in, subscribe to, because they think it serves their interests.
Okay. Yes. So you, you said that like in continental Europe, France, Europe, and France, Germany, and Italy, there is this issue that still is relevant, as
Mhm.
if silence is concerned. Now, my question, the next question would be that so in the 20th century, let's coming relating this to the Nakba. So the most important decade of the 20th century is the 1940s,
That's right.
as far as the changes in the global structure is concerned. So, if so, I'll give you a narrative that I get obviously from reading history and also from partly from reading your book. And the narrative is this, that there was this great British Empire which was crumbling, and during the Second World War, it invested so much in the military that ultimately, financially, it could not keep hold of different empires around the world, including the Indian subcontinent and also the British Mandate Palestine. But obviously, if there is a problem in the heart, it will spread to the body. Now,
Mhm.
if that is the case, they in the Indian let's see the Indian subcontinent because that's where I live. So in the Indian subcontinent, the British said, okay, we will have two states on the basis of religion. So there will be a Muslim majority country and then there will be a Hindu majority country. And then we had all, if not the same, but like the same ideology, the religious one, I mean, from religious perspective, functioned in Israel as well. Because on 15 May in 1948, when the British mandate was coming to an, in fact, it came into an end earlier on, I think in 1947, right,
That's right.
if I'm right, yeah. So during that time, they also said, okay, we are going to have a Jewish state, which is again a religious entity, I mean, a state on a religious basis. And then the empire actually contracted, and now it has contracted so much so that it has now deliberately done Brexit so that it goes back into itself.
That's right.
And now they have left this colonial, I mean, colonial state, not colonial state in the sense that they don't have colonies over, but like post-colonial states. But now it is the American task to do all of that. Or at least it seems to be that, because now we have the IMF in Pakistan who wants to do all of these things over here, financially speaking. And then there is in Israel, obviously now America has taken a much forward approach, a much larger, much more immediate approach than the British. Have I said this narrative correctly, or have I interpreted anything wrong in this whole thing?
No, I think generally speaking, you're right, but maybe the historian in me wants to have some
Yeah,
more
please.
fine tuning for this because it would interest our listeners
Yes, please.
and interlocutors. First of all, the difference between the British position on India and the British position on Palestine was that actually Britain in Palestine did not support partition. Britain abstained in the United Nations vote for partition. What the British wanted was, in fact, after years of supporting the idea of partition, was to continue an indirect kind of British control over historical Palestine. But more and more they were convinced, especially after Labour came to power in 1945, that the whole idea of the Jewish state was a mistake, and but they didn't have the energy or the interest to really be too much involved in it. But before, you're absolutely right that after that they said it's the American problem, not our problem. Not only Palestine, I mean the whole Mediterranean,
Mm.
because Britain became from an empire a second-rate or third-rate power. So they definitely the Labour Party understood, the Labour government understood that the days of the empire are more or less over. So in the case of Palestine, first of all, I think they, if you want their biggest sin, maybe it has some resemblance of what they did in India, but it's kind of a different angle, is that they left a vacuum. And even before the Americans went in, they knew, as I proved in my doctoral dissertation many years ago, they knew that the withdrawal, as they would plan it from Palestine, would allow the Zionist movement to ethnically cleanse Palestine and its people. I mean, that's the greatest sin. Not so much the idea of partition, because they were not anymore, you know, in love with the idea of partition for Palestine. But they really wanted out of there as quickly as possible when they realized that after the Holocaust, fighting against the Jewish resistance is difficult. Fighting against the Palestinian resistance is difficult if you want to maintain your interests in the Arab world, and they just wanted to get out of there, betraying their responsibility for protecting the people of Palestine. So that's the first point I would like to make. The second one is that, contrary to what people remember, the Americans took time to be drawn into Palestine. In fact, I would say until the days of President Kennedy, until his assassination, the American position, whereas it was quite, I would say, inflexible and draconian when it comes to the most of the Arab world, because they saw the Arab world as an arena in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. In the case of Palestine, successive American administrations actually were not so supportive of Israel as people remember, which is important because we don't want to take a teleological or deterministic approach to American policy in the future. In fact, the American policy, I would say, until 1963 was very much hesitant about the Israeli way of behaving towards the people of Palestine, the Palestinians. They were trying to pressure Israel to allow the Palestinians to return. They thought that Palestine did not have any strategic importance, and it just complicated their relationship with the rest of the Arab world. We have to remember that that was the point of view. This is the reason that Israel created a powerful lobby in the 50s and the 60s. They thought they had the American administrations in their hand, but it seemed they didn't. And that's why they created such a powerful lobby that since the assassination of Kennedy, and that's why so many people are not entirely convinced that they were not involved in that assassination, because after his assassination, we have the narrative that you are talking about. Namely, the United States is now the protector of Israel, the defender of Israel, the one that provides immunity, exceptional shield against any attempt from anywhere to protect the Palestinians and salvage them from the ongoing Nakba, as the Palestinians call it, the ongoing catastrophe. So I think it's important to look at these contours of history because they show you something about the future as well, because we tend to take these deterministic views. America will always be for Israel. I don't know, India would always be for Israel or something like that. We have to believe that these interests change for cynical reasons sometimes,
Mm.
but maybe also we as human beings, as civilians, have power to change the policies from above when it comes to places such as Palestine.
So that was the reason why I wanted to give you the narrative, and the audience narrative, that you then like dissect it and give us the proper version of how it actually the history has unfolded up until now. And Good that you mentioned the current situation. Like there are many nuances in the current situation, which is why I want you to give your opinion or assessment of the two recent events that have happened in this week. The first one is the most famous one. Netanyahu went to the U.S. Congress, and he was applauded 53 times over there.
Yeah.
And so I try to understand this thing a lot. Like even for example, if any former president stood up over there on the podium and gave a wonderful speech, we can expect, for example, 10 times, 12 times, perhaps something like that. I mean, 50, more than 50 times basically means almost a clap after a minute. He was hardly speaking in a sense.
Yeah.
So, like, what do you take away from this presentation, the presentation or the reception that was given to Netanyahu?
Yeah. I think it has two dimensions. One dimension has to do with domestic American politics, and it's connected to the longevity of the lobby for Israel and Zionism in the United States, as I mentioned, which was becoming particularly effective in the 50s and the 60s, but had a long history going back to the end of the First World War. And this effective lobby, by the way, which is not just Jewish lobby, the Christian Zionists, as we call them, namely important churches of evangelical Christianity, play a very important role in this lobby alongside military industry, security industry, multinational corporations. So there's a whole alliance there that has been gelled into a powerful lobby over the years to such an extent that until now, until recently, both houses of the Congress, by inertia, even without any need for the lobby to be very active now, because it has been so effective for such a long time, know exactly what is expected from them when it comes to Israel, whether it is an unconditional support for legislation, against Palestinians, against the Arabs, for Israel, or receiving Netanyahu the way they received. In fact, whenever Netanyahu speaks, and even those before him who were Israeli prime ministers who spoke there, I mean, they can read from a phone book and they will get 54 evasion. This is very little to do with the content. It was just to the lobby wants to show that the Congress is still totally in its hands. But compared to other appearances, this time 80 members of the Congress, which is still a minority given the large number of both representatives and senators, yet much larger than ever before, said we're not playing the game. And I think that's a trend that will continue. So we have to take that into account. But right now, historically, where we are, you can be sure that whoever gets elected in 2024, in the coming November elections, the Congress will behave in the same way. Because it is the result of this the long existing or the very powerful, effective lobby that exists in the United States. So that's one dimension. What is interesting is how the speech was viewed in Israel itself, which has to do with Israeli domestic politics and not with the American domestic politics. The, the speech highlighted the current divide, deep divide we have within the Israeli Jewish society between what you can call the secular Jews and the religious Jews. You can call it the right and left in Israel, it doesn't matter. And there is a huge divide. There is, in fact, an implosion of the Israeli society from within. Unfortunately, I say this someone who supports the Palestinian cause, this has nothing to do with Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, not even with the Israeli genocide of Gaza. This is a domestic struggle that has one common basis, which is that Israel should continue to be an apartheid state. But it's a discussion of whether Israel should be a secular apartheid state, liberal for the Jews and multicultural for the Jews who live there, or should it be a theocratic Jewish state? And Netanyahu's speech, I think, was as much directed to his base, which is this religious Jewish group that I used to call State of Judea, to show them that he can get galvanized support in America for their views. But a lot of people in Israel were very annoyed by it, and it exposed what really troubles the many in the Israeli Jewish society today, Netanyahu's total indifference to the fate of those Israelis who are captured by the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad in Gaza. It was clear that in that speech, that he cares very little about their fate, and he needs a war to continue to stay in power. And this is more or less the message domestically he gave to the Israelis, which some of them, quite a large number of them, do not accept. But we'll see how it will unfold in the future.
And there's an interesting point you just said, that the the effect of Netanyahu's speech in Israeli domestic politics, because that was the event that I want to discuss, which happened unfortunately yesterday, in which the Israeli army spokesperson said that Druze community was targeted this time around
Yeah,
in the Golan Heights.
that's right.
Now, it is ironic, because yesterday when I was actually waiting for you to join and discuss this thing, to be very frank, I encountered Druze community for the first time in your book, and this is the second time I'm encountering Druze community on the television. So, and this brings me back to Nakba, and also connected to how the spread of population or the concentration of population is in Israel right now, and then we can talk about the education system. So the thing is that in the book you say that the Druze community survived the Nakba because they collaborated with the Haganah, the Israeli higher command. Now, you obviously talk about the way the Druze community, the beliefs that they have, the way they are organized and stuff like that. But my question is that, okay, once Israel was made, and these are Muslims, Druze Muslims, once Israel has been established, like in around 49, 50, when they start to actually populate the areas that they have occupied, was there, because that's where I think your book stops. What I want to ask is that, was there an urban strategy that that we will have, for example, because I'm thinking with a very very naive layman real estate perspective kind of thing. The places that are close to threat should be appointed to people who are not the center of the community, stuff like that. So places near Gaza, places near the West Bank, places on the Golan Heights will be concentrated with a particular kind of population, naturally speaking. I'm not saying that there's I don't know if it's deliberate or not, but I want to understand this thing. So from Nakba up until 1948 up until now, how has the concentration of the population been spread in the Israeli territory?
Yeah, yeah. Again, it's more complex than it seems, and some of what you say is ringing truthful, but it's a bit more complex.
Hmm.
Let me just start with the Druze. I think the Druze communities are spread all over the Middle East, and they have, I'm not sure whether it's a religious imperative or this is kind of an acquired historical experience, um, by which they try to not to oppose the power that be where they are. So there would not be pro-Israeli Druze in Lebanon, and there will be no pro-Israeli
Hmm.
Druze in Syria.
Hmm.
So you won't have that kind of collaboration, you know, apart from within what became the state of Israel. I think that's very important to understand, because that's the way the community survives, because it is considered by could be considered by some mainstream Islamic establishment as heretic and not and therefore could have a history of sometimes persecution and so on. So that's their instinct, is to go along with the power that be. The Druze in the Golan Heights, which tragically yesterday 11, 12 of their kids were killed in a football game, hit by a rocket probably launched by Hezbollah from Lebanon. Um, they are a different case because they were annexed to Israel in 1967, and many of them, not all of them, but many of them, still see themselves as citizens of Syria and refuse to accept the Israeli identity card. Therefore, some of them would, we can hear it from the interviews they were giving, unlike an Israeli community, a typical Israeli community that would react to such a tragedy by saying, we want the Israeli government to go to war in Lebanon and kill Lebanese and so on, some of them said very clearly, we think the only solution is to end the war in Gaza, and then things would come to some normality, which you will never hear from a Jewish Israeli citizen, right? So it's a bit more complex, these ones. Now, the the settlement policy you're talking about is very interesting. It has two dimensions for it. The Jews who were in many ways brought from the Arab countries after the creation of the State of Israel, Israel was not very interested in Jews in Arab and Muslim countries before, because they wanted, Zionism was about to creating a European country. And they deemed the Jews in Arab countries and Muslim countries as Arabs, and therefore there was no much desire to bring them over. However, because of the Holocaust, on the one hand, and the fact that quite a lot of Jews in Britain and the United States chose to stay in their home countries rather than immigrate to Israel, there was a demographic need to bring Jews from the Arab world. And 1 million Jews were brought from the Arab world, from North Africa, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and so on. And the fear was that because of their Arab identity and culture, they would show affinity with the Arabs of Israel, the Palestinians. And one way of de-Arabizing them was indeed to put them on the borders, which everybody knew were spaces of friction, to intensify their animosity towards the Arabs, which worked, which, by the way, was a method that unfortunately worked. In the case of all the other borders, and that's the second dimension, you still had the old guard of Zionists, mostly European Jews, who were socialists and created the kibbutz, this collective community that is more or less disappearing from the Israeli social landscape. And they were ideologically committed to build the kibbutz on the border, whether with Gaza or Lebanon, as part of their notion, which is very typical to a settler colonial project. They saw themselves both as settlers and soldiers. And they were built there far more committed, I would say, than the Arab Jews to defend the borders of Israel as part of this ideology of settler colonialism, that you are the frontier. You're the frontier. So the way governments located people on the borders it has both being cynical ideas of de-Arabizing the Arab Jews, but also ideologically motivated by this notion that we are familiar for other settler colonial projects like the United States. The armed settler, the settler is both cultivating the land or cultivating the land in one hand and holding a gun on the others. And then, of course, they are surprised that they are being treated by the Hamas as military bases and not just as civilian communities, which doesn't mean that I justify everything that was done. I want to say it. On the 7th of October, I can explain why it happened, but I'm not justifying everything that happened. Because these are communities that have also families and children and so on. But it is important to understand this, the ideology behind it. I would call it the twin ideology behind settling Jews on the borders of the Jewish state. Not to mention, if I just add, this became even a more bizarre phenomenon with the Jews that decided to colonize the West Bank. those who after 67, this was even an aberration of this whole idea. You are not only sitting on a frontier, you
Mm,
see your role as being actively involved in ethnically cleansing the Palestinians on the West Bank by settling near their villages and towns in order to push them out of there. So that's kind of a development that happened
mm.
after 1967, and this is in many ways the electoral base of Netanyahu today.
So again, your conversation is blending into the next topic that I also highlighted in the email that we shared, that we're going to talk about something called the economics of Zionism.
Mhm.
Now, the thing that not troubled me in the sense, but like I was searching for throughout your book in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, was a very basic question: where was the money coming from? Now, the and there, you do mention the Soviet Russia and Czechoslovakia, I think, and there are some countries named that you mentioned within the book that supported financially the Zionist project. But right now, as we talk, whenever we talk about the Palestinian history, there seems to be two dates very important that are very important, like 448, obviously, and then 67. And as we
Mhm.
were discussing recent just now about the dates close to Kennedy's assassination. Now, the thing I want to ask is so I don't know about APAC that much, to be very frank, because your book has not arrived yet in Pakistan. It will arrive on the 30th July, and then I'll be the first person who will read it beyond lobbying for Zionism on both sides of the Atlantic. But here's my question: that we understand that Zionists are really, really wealthy. I mean, it's assumed, and obviously there is fact that proves it. But the point I'm trying to make is that, as you said earlier on, we don't care about whether there will be a Republican president or a Democratic president. In the same way, in the UK, we don't care about whether there be a Labour prime minister or a Conservative prime minister. We know their policy against or towards Israel will not budge so much. Now, which means that there's a bipartisan support, or at least something, or like the Zionists or whoever are responsible for doing this, supporting these two parties, have created such a portfolio that they don't get, I mean, so much questions on either side of the aisle. Now, here's the question: how is it possible that they are so wealthy, and yet they have, because there are other wealthy people as well. It's not like just the Zionists are wealthy. There are many wealthy people, but this Zionist project, they was started with obviously a lot of wealth. Where do they get this money from, and how are they, when we say they are supporting, for example, we know that okay, there are companies that they get money from. I don't know if there are other sources. You are much better an expert on this thing, but like when we say they are supporting, so there are two questions: where are they getting money from? The second one is, when we say they are supporting the parties, what do we exactly mean by that? I never, because I thought there is donation, there is this, there is that, but what exactly is this support kind of?
Well, it's again, history is a bit more complex than that.
Yeah.
The early Zionists were very poor people, and and did not live in very wealthy conditions. We have to say this, and it's one of the reasons they went for socialism. Were not only the believe in this as a just ideological idea, but because it was economically much easier to survive through collective communities than through bourgeoisie kind of way of life.
Mm.
Um, and the early state of Israel, when it was established in 1948, was also not very rich. Israel went through a recession, I'm sorry, recession and a time of really economic crisis at the very beginning. What saved Israel, because there was a time when the Americans were still not providing much financial aid to Israel. What really saved Israel in the 50s was the West German finance, which was the big deal that Israel, as supposedly the representative of the victims of the Holocaust absolves West Germany from the Nazi past in return for a huge financial aid, which came in the early 50s. The second thing I want to say is that Israel became a state. I mean, we can call it, and I do call it, as a Zionist project. And as you know, I think it is in a huge trouble and disintegrating. But nonetheless, it's a state, which means there are wealthy people in it and there are very poor people in it. In fact, the gap between those who have and those who haven't in Israel is as wide as it's ever been. So you have a lot of communities who are not well off. You have an elite which is well off, but that's not different from many other countries. I think what you want to know is about more about the aid to the state as a state, which well, we have to remember that there are 8 million Jews in Israel, and not all of them benefit from the fact
Yeah.
that the state gets money. The state gets money that is used to build a powerful army, a high-tech
Exactly.
economy, and so on. Now, what really, two things to be said until the 7th of October about the Israeli economy and its financial resources, sources rather, as you're interested in, which you rightly so. First of all, the American aid is exceptional in terms of money, exceptional. Secondly, Israel itself generates capital, generated quite successfully until recently capital by being a high-tech nation, by being one of the world's leading exporter of arms.
Mm.
Uh, and these two industries provide, foreign currency that helps to operate the state in macroeconomic terms, which again does not mean that it deals at all with poverty, the gap between the poor and the rich, and so on. So, in microeconomic terms, it's not a very successful economy. In macroeconomic terms, it is. It was, at least. Why do I say it was? And maybe I just should add that money also flows all the time from Jewish communities and Christian Zionist communities as well. And so these are huge sums, they are not small sums. But I think what happened on both sides of the aisles, as you call it rightly, that although after the 7th of October, an exceptional huge aid package of $14 billion was approved for Israel, for the first time, the Israeli economists realized that this is not enough, that the internal sources that generate capital are not enough. 14 billion are not enough, where at least $3 billion a year were enough a few years ago. Now 14 billions in half a year is not enough. Tells you something. You
Yeah.
don't have to be a clever economist to understand
Yeah.
that the needs to maintain the state of Israel as an apartheid state that commits genocide, that oppresses the Palestinians in the West Bank, that is facing an angry, I would say even hungry, Arab world on its borders. The money it has until now is not enough to produce an efficient military response, to give the society a sense that there is a financial compensation for its hardships and so on. When people become internal refugees in their own country, you cannot buy their confidence. All this shows you that whatever were in the past the sources that definitely were needed, financial sources, to begin the Zionist project, to build the new state in 1948, and to sustain it as a very successful economy since 67, so that it was admitted to the OECD, the most important club of successful economic countries in the world. I think there are only 8 in the OECD. All of it was a bit a facade for an economy that wasn't working. But we didn't know it until recently. And therefore, that's also very important to understand. There is a material basis for Israel that it still holds it together. And it comes from the United States, it comes from Jewish community, Christian Zionist community, multinational corporation, military industry, security industry. The big question is, two big questions here, which are important. Well, maybe three factors I would mention. One is, although I said, and I stand behind it, that whoever wins the 2024 November elections in America, don't expect dramatic changes in the policies toward Israel,
mm,
but do expect dramatic changes in American policy
mm,
along the way. And interestingly, how it might work, although these are contradictory scenarios, either America would go through the more progressive democratic way, which
mm,
is a possibility, and then for moral reasons, it would decrease its support for Israel, or ironically, it would go the Trump way, the Donald Trump way,
mm,
and would be an isolationist United States that doesn't want to invest money either in the Ukraine or in Israel.
mm,
We already saw the signs of it. So whatever the scenario is for Israel in the longer future in America, either cynical people there would see it not anymore as a great investment for the American taxpayer, or morally would ask whether the American taxpayers should support it. Yes, there's always a chance that the current reality of July 2024 will continue for a while. Maybe, Kamala Harris would be a Bidenist if she wins the elections and keeps the policy as it is. But this is really for the short run. I cannot see that maintained for a very long time. So that's also very important to take into account.
yeah. No, thank you for like expanding upon this thing because I have been generalizing so that you pick out
No, that's fine.
the specific points because that's what I
Absolutely.
want to know. Okay, I'll give you like a very short description of how we see Israel and Pakistan. Obviously, it's my personal take, but because I myself never took the term Zionism as seriously as we have taken from this year onwards, for example, after 7th October. We
Right.
always considered over here, it is considered this like an Illuminati project and stuff like that. I mean, I'm talking about a very lame and stupid kind of thingy. And we never talked about Zionism. And whenever we heard, like, for example, Biden saying that I'm a Zionist, or, I mean, the other Krauthammer, for example, saying I'm a Zionist, we always thought, okay, I mean, maybe there is something happening or whatnot. But now we finally know that there is a very, like, especially after getting to know your book and listening to your talks also, that there's a very, very firm basis of Zionism. It's not just like a propaganda stuff. So that's one thing I wanted to clarify because over here, there are many misunderstandings going on
Yeah.
regarding this
Yeah.
Zionism thing. Now I wanted to touch. I have so many things, but we don't have time. We just have 15 more minutes. So I'll just touch upon education. I mean, because you have been professor at Haifa University, and it will also touch upon your personal. I mean, I want to ask about the personal motivation for you to write so many books on Palestine. I mean, because I mean, I don't. I mean, I understand why when you take a decision to write a book, it's not just a decision that you take in a day. It's like you have to go and do a lot of research and then compile it, write it, then edit it, and it's a long process. It's very, I mean, sweaty project, a sweaty, I mean, prospect to actually take a course of writing a book. But my question, first of all, is that how do you consider the Palestinian representation in the Israeli education system from the primary education onwards up until the university? And then if you can somehow tell your own personal experience as well of the education project or of the education culture or syllabus like that, because that would be also a personal touch and as well as the Israeli national
Yeah.
education system.
Yeah. So let's start with the general picture. Then the general picture is an education system that is very indoctrinating, first of all, from cradle to grave in many ways. And indoctrination does not come only through educational system, it comes through the media, the discourse of the politicians, the army, which is a very important tool of socialization. in Israel. So if you look at all these institutions, you can see that there's a very clear image of the Palestinian, which people are educated about and informs their position later on. It begins by the historical image of the Palestinian as an alien, as someone who has no right to the country and was there as a nomad or instigated by other forces to try and stop the amazing project of the return of the Jewish people to their ancient homeland. So there is an historical perspective of the Palestinians as landless people who are trying to prevent violently a very just and noble project of the creation of a Jewish state. Then there is a more contemporary images of the Palestinians. And what is really troubling when you look at the textbooks and the education system, there is a clear attempt to connect the history of anti-Semitism in Europe with the Palestinians' actions against Zionism until 1948 and Israel after 1948. Namely, there seems to be very little hope for a graduate of the Israeli education system to understand that the violence, and there is violence in some of the Palestinian actions against, first of all, the Jewish community until 1948 and the state of Israel after 1948, that violence is a reaction to the violence of the colonizer, of the occupier, which they would learn about, the FLN in Algeria, the Mao Mao in Kenya, or even Gandhi in India, if you want, resistance movement, anti-colonialist resistance movements in the world, and they would cherish them. They will not deem them to be anti-Semites or terrorists, but they are able through the education system to exceptionalize the Palestinian resistance as a continuation of the classical anti-Semitism. So they do what they do because they hate Jews, because who the Jews are, not because what this particular group of Jews is doing to them and to their homeland. So that's a very difficult image to deal with, and of course it instigate hate, racism more than anything else, and dehumanization of the Palestinians. In my case, although I was a product of this education system, obviously I was not a very successful product. And I was not alone. And looking at, unfortunately, but we're a small group of people, not a large group of people, who somehow this very indoctrinating machine did not work on us. Why didn't it work on us? Each one of us has a different explanation. We are different stories, but we have some things in common. For instance, I was born in Haifa, which is far more mixed cities than most cities in Israel. So I had a more intimate relationship with the Palestinian society, and it's much difficult to dehumanize people you know as neighbors and so on. Secondly, I did my studies outside of Israel, you know, getting out. You can see things you cannot see from within. I had the fortunate chance to be mentored by Palestinian and Arab professors in Oxford, where I went to do my PhD. And so when I returned to Israel, I already returned with a very different view. And of course, my research substantiated for me these issues. And there was a point around 2002, which continued for about 4 or 5 years, when I realized that you cannot go against the grain from within. I mean, you can try, and I did try, but they will destroy you. And they expelled me from the university, and that's why I had to go and teach in England. Uh, and writing books was the one thing, writing books in English, not in Hebrew, is one thing they could not rob me of. I mean, they could rob me of my job in the university. They might still rob me of my citizenship, which they didn't do until now. That's why I can go in and out to Israel and to see my Palestinian friends and so on. But that might change. But they cannot prevent me from publishing books in English. I wish I could publish books in Hebrew because I also want to educate my compatriots. You know, I think they should know as well. But that's more difficult because publishers here in Israel will not publish me. But at least I wanted to share because I knew there were a lot of good people there who know nothing about Palestine, and if they knew, they would be much more active in trying and help and end the suffering of the Palestinians. And I think my book, The Ethnic Cleansing, and for many people around the world did the job, and like some other books. Yeah.
No, I want to read a quote directly from your book so that, because I want to ask this thing right at the end, and then
Yeah.
we can, we can, because this is a very pertinent question right now. I think the question of the day. But first of all, the quote. So you say on page 181 in the chapter entitled Completing the Job, after discussing Operation Hiram, you say, I have no illusion that it will take more than this book to reverse a reality that demonizes a people who have been colonized, expelled, and occupied, and glorifies the very people who colonized, expelled, and occupied them. Now, my question is simple, because I think you addressed this question in the recent book. Uh, you want to fight against Zionism. That's what I understand from your position. How can we end? Not end. How can we fight effectively against
Yeah.
Zionism?
By the way, I also want to fight against Zionism because I think it's bad for the Jews, not just for the Palestinians. That is a very important motive for my work. I really think Jews and Arabs alike could live a much better life in historical Palestine without Zionism. Definitely the Palestinians, because Zionism does give a lot of privileges to the Jews. But I think in the long run, we can see how unsafe Jews feel today. Now, how can we do this? I think that historically, looking at the way projects that were violating human rights and civil rights and were unjust at the very core did not disappear in one day, firstly.
Mm,
Secondly, there was not one process, there was not one factor that caused them to change or disappear or end, whichever will happen here. And I do think I'm now much more aware, which is a new book I'm writing now. Uh, uh, I'm much more aware of the processes that have to, they are discrete processes, namely that they will happen separately, but I think they can fuse together into transformative powerful event that would change the reality on the ground. And they include the continued implosion of the Israeli society from within, the fact that the younger Jewish generation in the world does not see itself anymore as Zionist. In fact, many of them are willing to be active in the solidarity movement with the Palestinians. We talked about the economy, which is not functioning.
mm,
We can add to this the army. The Israelis are still traumatized by the fact that everything they believed about their army is not working. When the generals tell them today, it's very hard for us to maintain two fronts
mm,
at the same time. And they're not talking about two fronts against two conventional armies, as if Pakistan would have fought Iran and India at the same time. You would
yeah.
understand if an Iraqi, Pakistani general would say, fighting both China, India, and Iran, we have to be. No, they're not even fighting conventional armies. They're
Mm,
fighting two guerrilla groups that have no aeroplanes and no tanks and no artillery, you know,
exactly.
and yet they find that they cannot do this. It's a worrying sign for them. They should hopefully think that maybe there is an alternative. And you can add to this the new generation of Palestinians, which I think can solve some of the problems that malayed, that really affect the Palestinian national movement. It's factionalism and disunity. It's a lack of any clear vision, which is an important revolution that has to take place for for Zionism to end. You cannot end Zionism unless the Palestinians get their act together, and they haven't got their act together. I mean, they are resisting and they are
Mm.
resilient, and that is a very important factor, but it's not a factor that would change the reality
Yeah.
unless they get their act together. And I think there will be changes in the Arab world as well. I think Israel is becoming more isolated in international community and so on. So there are, if you are an activist, there are things you can contribute to, and there are things you cannot contribute to, but you have to observe and see how they work together to help them become a reality. And I think we are now beginning to see these processes. And that's why I call my next book The End of Israel with a question mark, because I'm not a prophet,
Mhm.
but I'm trying to say that, the end of something is the beginning of something else. Uh, and some people misunderstand it. They think that I'm there, trying to blow up my own state and destroy it and kill all the
Yeah.
people. No, that's not for me, is not an end. The end is the end of a regime, which is an apartheid regime, the end of colonization, of genocide and ethnic cleansing. These things have to end. They have to end. But in order for them to end permanently, or with hope, of course, we also have to think about what should replace them. And luckily, I feel that with all these dark moments that we're all experiencing here in historical Palestine, and for me, it's the darkest moment of them all, what is going on. It's even worse than Nakba in 1948. Um, there is there's a light in the end of the tunnel, and that light is connected to the end of Zionism and the beginning of something better. But it's a long process. It will take time, and it's not happen by itself. People have to be in different functions, have to contribute to it.
So, if I can summarize your answer, so broadly speaking, there are two things that you said. That there must be, first of all, an implosion within Israel which should force it to self reflect. And then the Palestinian position also needs to amend itself and consider the Jewish population to be someone who should welcome them within their state.
Yeah,
Do you think the second part is right? The first one you nodded, but
no,
the
no,
second
there's a
part.
difference. There's a difference. The first one is not a precondition. If the implosion would not lead the Israelis to reflect, there's still a chance for liberating Palestine and decolonizing it.
Okay.
Even if the colonizer does not, like in South Africa,
Mm.
if the colonizer does not eh, understand what it should do, it can be forced to do it. However, a united Palestinian liberation movement is a precondition, not for the implosion from within. Of course, Israel will implode with or without a united Palestinian position. But we want, as human beings, the implosion to lead to something better, because otherwise it will continue to create chaos and violence. And that's what we don't want. Look at Syria. Syria is a disintegrating state. Libya
Mm.
is a failed state. These failed states are not offering right now alternatives to their people. So the violence goes on and on. Sudan, south of Sudan. All these places around the world should send us a warning that the end of regimes, civil wars, disintegrations, if they're not replaced by a better project for human beings, can create a long periods of chaos and violence. And there's nothing we want in Palestine.
No, thank you so much for that explanation, and that concludes. I mean, that's the best way to conclude that one day we hope to see Jews, Muslims, and Christians living back
Indeed,
together in Palestine like they were living for centuries.
absolutely,
Okay,
absolutely, yes,
thank you, Ilan, so much. If you can just stick around, I'll just turn off the live and then
yeah, that's
we can
okay.
just.